Welcome to the Quiverful Adoptions podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Elizabeth.
And I'm Casey. We are two adoptive mamas who have walked in your shoes, so we get it.
We remember the crazy journey of adoption like it was yesterday, and we are so thankful we get to share some amazing stories with you right here from the living room of our office.
Well, actually, we're sitting in the bathroom, but the living room does sound better.
Anyway, none of that matters. We're glad you're here.
So grab a cup of coffee and join us as we dive right in.
Hey guys.
Hey friends.
So just a quick reminder before we get started, we are still selling tickets for the Promise Summit, but we have a limited number of those that are left. So if you want to purchase your tickets online, you can go to www.thepromisesummit.com. You can also find out more about the Promise Summit on Instagram at the Promise Summit.
I'm so excited for that Promise Summit.
It's going to be great, and you need to purchase your tickets. You need to be there. It's for everybody. It doesn't matter what agency or attorney you've worked with. It doesn't matter if you've already brought home your child and received placement or if you're just getting started. You need to be there. So, Casey, who do we have today on the podcast?
Today we're chatting with Macie Perreault, founder of AdoptWell, an online education community for adoptive families. Macie lives in Charlotte, North Carolina with her husband Greg, her sons Porter and Judah, and their daughter Brighton. She is an adoptive mama and is passionate about preparing other families to adopt well. Not just during their adoption, but after. Today we are going to hear a little bit about her story, what led her to adoption, and as well as the heart behind AdoptWell.
I'm so excited. I love Macie, and I think everybody's really going to enjoy the podcast today. One of the big things right now in the adoption community is just talking about you don't know what you don't know.
Right. I think that it's very important for us to remember that we are constantly trying to educate ourselves before we adopt and then also during the adoption process, but it shouldn't stop there. It should continue to go throughout our children's lives. So as long as we are their parents, we need to continue educating ourselves on adoption and the adoption process.
And we don't always get it right. I don't know about you, Casey, but I can think of a million things I did wrong my first adoption journey. Things that I look back at now and I'm like, why did I do that?
Right.
So there's grace for days, and I think that is one of the reasons why Macie's work with AdoptWell is so important, so that we as adoptive parents continue to educate ourselves and pick up where we've messed up and move forward and do better next time.
Right. And not sitting there and dwelling on what we've done wrong, but just continuing to move forward, like you said.
Absolutely.
Let's go.
Hey guys.
Hey friends.
Hey Macie.
Hey, how are you guys doing?
We are good. Macie, start by telling us a little bit about your story and how you stepped into your adoption journey.
Sure. So my name is Macie Perreault. My husband Greg and I live right outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, and we have 3 children. We have Porter. He is our oldest. He's 4, and we always knew before we ever even got married that we wanted to have a ton of kids. And so we had him pretty soon after being married, and when he was 8 months old, we decided we were ready to start trying again, and we ended up actually going through a couple of years of secondary infertility, which I didn't even know was a thing, but it was very hard, and going through that process, we ended up having a couple of miscarriages, and we just really felt the Lord leading us to grow our family through adoption. And so we just began praying into it and took some time to just make sure we were on the right page, that we had grieved our infertility, and that we were doing it for the right reasons. And after a couple of years, we decided to pursue domestic infant adoption with you guys, of course, and adopted our son Judah, and he is now 13 months old, and then we went on to have another baby after that, and I'm actually pregnant again. So God has been very good, to say the least.
Well, congratulations on your pregnancy. That is
Thank you
incredible.
so much. It's amazing how when we think one door is completely closed, I had to really come to a place in our infertility journey where I made sure that having a large family or having another child wasn't an idol or just something that I desired. And before we even came to the point of growing our family through adoption, the Lord really led us on a journey of being sure that we were fully surrendering to Him. And He actually led us to a place of being okay with never having more children if that was His will for us. And so to go to that point where we were like, okay, Lord, we trust you. If your will is only for us to have one child, we will be completely fine with that. But now to see our dream come to fruition so quickly of having a large family has just been amazing.
Yeah.
Incredible.
That's awesome.
Macie, what was your biggest fear during the
My
adoption
biggest
process?
fear, I don't know if this is like the most normal or the silliest, but honestly was that we would never be chosen. I don't know if that's like a normal thing or not, but we knew that the Lord had led us to it. And so there was the large part of me that was like, nope, God led us to this. I know it's going to be amazing. I know it's going to happen in His time. But then there was just that small part of me, and I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing, but where I was kind of like, but you know what? Like, this is not a right that I own. These are other women's babies that we're talking about here. It's completely up to them to choose. And I like how y'all have always said hopeful adoptive families, because I remember at the time being like, oh, we're not hoping to adopt, we're adopting. But ultimately, when you're adopting, you really have to have open hands and be okay with whatever happens. So that was kind of my biggest thing.
Absolutely. So you have adopted transracially. So is that something that you always felt like would be something that your family would pursue?
Not necessarily. We actually never really thought adoption would be a part of our story, which is insane to me now. But we just thought we would have no problem having biological children. And of course, I'm so thankful that we did because we were able to grow our family. But that was never something that we planned for. And of course, that was one of the big conversations that we had when we first started the process. And thankfully, we had a wonderful woman who did our home study, and she is white and her husband is black. And so she was able to tell us a bunch of things to be prepared for as a white mother to children of color. And she said, you know, this is not something to take on lightly. This is not something that I recommend everyone does. And she kind of laid out for us, here are the things that I deal with. If you guys decide to adopt transracially or to be open to adopting a child of another ethnicity, you're going to need to be prepared to learn new things, to change your environment if that's the case, so that your child is not the odd man out, for lack of a better term. And you're even going to need to be prepared for the fact that if you adopt a child of the same color, people from the outside looking in won't always know that your child was adopted. But if you adopt a child of another color, your child's going to constantly be told by their friends and asked by people, well, where that can't be your mother, how is she your mom? And so it definitely adds another layer. And so that was something we really had to pray into. And of course, I am so glad that we were open to it. But it's funny, when we first went into adoption, I was like, oh yeah, we will totally adopt a child of any color. That doesn't matter to us at all. And I'm really thankful that she took the time to slow us down and show us, like, if you're willing to do this, you need to be willing to put in the work and know that it will be a little bit harder. So yeah.
What's one of the things that you've changed in your family or in your life since bringing Judah home?
Well, a couple of things. Probably the biggest thing is how aware we are now of our surroundings. So, first off, I have reached out to way more friends of color and just asked them, like, humbly, I do not know what it's like to be a person of color in America today. Can you tell me some of your experiences? Can you tell me what you think Judah will need from me? Can you tell me what I can do well for him? And then also, really just being aware of, okay, thankfully our church is very diverse. We actually have a one campus of our church that we just merged with is like 95% African American, and our campus that we go to is probably 50%. And we will be aware of that when it comes to school and whatnot too. And then the other thing is, we have a lot of friends and family who are all about like, let's all buy land, let's all build houses together. And that has always been our life plan. But I think we're going to just stay put where we are for now in our neighborhood because it's very diverse, and we don't want to go live with all of our friends, but have our son be the only person of color around. So,
So wise.
Yeah. How would you tell a family that they can know if transracial adoption is right for them?
well, I have a couple thoughts on that. I would say, first off, just observe your surroundings. I grew up in Maine, and it is seriously like 99.9% white. And if I lived in Maine, I would have had to put in a lot more work, that's for sure, to make our life more culturally diverse and whatnot. So I would say, first off, look around, and it's not necessarily a problem if there are not a lot of people of color around, but I think you have to make sure that you kind of seek out racial mirrors for your child in some way if you can. And then I would also say, just make sure that you're willing to do things that will make you uncomfortable. Like, first off, facing your own implicit biases. I didn't even know that I had implicit biases, but just throughout my life over the years of conditioning through the news and everything else I did. And so I have had to face those, and it's been really painful, but also really healing. And the Lord has been really faithful to just teach me through that. And then also, the other thing would be listening to the voices of transracial adoptees and finding out, asking them, okay, what did your parents do well? What do you wish your parents did differently? What do you wish your parents would have provided for you? Asking them, like, honestly, what were your struggles? How do you feel about transracial adoption? I think that's one of the best ways that we can prepare, if not the best way, is just listening to the voices of people of color and specifically transracial adoptees.
Going back to the racial mirrors thing, we went to a conference a few months ago and were really enlightened to the fact that I don't have any racial mirrors in my direct community that, or I do, but I would have to go really far out to find racial mirrors if I were to adopt a Black child or a biracial child. So the thing that they did was they gave us these lemon head candies and then Whopper candies, and then they gave us a cup. And so they would ask questions like, think about your barbershop or your hairdresser that you go to. Are you in contact with a Black barber or a white barber or a white beautician or whatever? And so if you were obviously in contact with a Black barber, you would drop a
Lemon head.
no,
Or
a Whopper.
a Whopper. Sorry,
And
yeah.
then if you were in contact with a white one, you would put the lemon head in there.
Right.
And so they went through this list of things. And by the time we got to the end of it, I had one Whopper because my neighbors across the street from us are Black. And we eat dinner with them and hang out with them frequently, but they're the only Black people in my life. And so I don't think that that would be enough for us if we were to adopt a Black child. Like, that would not be enough of a racial mirror.
Right.
Would you agree with that? Or like, do you think that that would be enough for a family that is considering adopting transracially to only have one set of racial mirrors?
That is a great question and a great exercise. I have a couple of thoughts, I guess. First off, I have a friend who runs this amazing ministry. It's called Brownicity, and it's all about racial healing, and it's just incredible. And I was telling her about the whole land thing and not building and all of that, and she was like, well, just remember that although it's good for your child, and it of course is, but to be around people of color, it's very important that they are around people in general who are just aware of race issues and their own implicit biases, and will just treat them with dignity and respect. And that kind of shifted my mindset a little, because I think there are both sides where, like, color does matter. We are not colorblind. color matters. People of different color will deal with different things, but the heart also matters. And so it's one of those things where it's like, I think that we can combine both, and I think it's all very situational. But I do think that from listening specifically to the voices of transracial adoptees, I have never talked to one who has not felt that having a significant amount of racial mirrors was not very helpful. So, yeah.
So one other question that I wanted to talk about is some of the families that come to us, their immediate family members are either racist or very against them adopting a child of color into their home. So for those families that are still pursuing adoption, of adopting a child with color, or still keeping their hearts and homes open to a child of color, what is the best way for them to continue moving forward? Do you feel like they should either step back and reevaluate, or should they, just ignore those family members and not have their child around them? Like, what would you recommend for those
Oh, that is
families?
so tough. And I hear about this all the time. I really think that the most important thing would be realizing that when you have a child, just like when you get married, your spouse becomes your number one. And if you've got a problem with my spouse, then I've got a problem with you, type of deal. And then obviously, when we
Right.
have children, it is our job to protect them and shepherd them and nurture them, provide a loving environment for them. And so I think that I would say, if it were me personally, um, I would still pursue it if I really felt like the Lord wanted my family to and had called me to be open to it. I would absolutely do it. But I would do it cautiously, and I would do it with the understanding that my child will come first. And that might mean closing the door on other family members if it comes to that down the road. Of course, I would be praying for racial healing and reconciliation and that my family would come around and learn through it. But I also don't think that adopting a child of color is like, I think some people are like, well, this is how they'll come around because they'll fall in love with this child. But that's just not really how it works. And so, yeah.
Well, let's shift gears here and let's talk a little bit about openness. How can we adopt well with the intention to love first when a biological family initially wants closed but may change that years down the road?
Sure. So, with our son, when we talked to his birth mom specifically, he was actually already born when she chose us. And when we first heard about him from y'all, we knew that they had hoped for or wanted a closed adoption. And we were kind of bummed because we really felt called to an open adoption. We hoped for an open adoption, both for the birth parent's sake and the child's sake. But we also felt the Lord telling us say yes to this situation. So I talked to his birth mom on the phone for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. And by the end of the conversation, she said, well, I will give you my number because I guess I would be open to getting pictures. And I was so thankful. And so I would say, like with everything in adoption, I would hold the level of openness with open hands and know and honestly hope and pray for more and more openness, because it has been proven time and time again that 99% of the time, I'm not talking about the cases where it's not, but 99% of the time it is what's best, especially for the adoptee. And so I just think that it's so important that we remember this really comes back to understanding too that we do not let adopting a baby become an idol and become all about us and become about just adding a child to our family, because ultimately adopting is not the same as having a biological child. Adoption,
Right.
literally, there are two mothers, there are two fathers. Like, that is what adoption is. And so I think that that can be really hard, especially for people who have not grieved their infertility, if that has what has led them to adoption, because they so badly want to make it the same as having a biological child. And if the doors just close, then it won't be confusing and it won't be whatever. And none of that is even true. It's not confusing for the child, but I think that the more openness you can have in the ideal situation, the better, especially for the adoptee.
I love that. I love the piece that you said, and I just want to highlight that again, that adoption is not the same as having biological kids. Adoption literally is a situation where there are two mothers and two fathers. And I think that's so important if hopeful adoptive families, as they're even beginning to start the adoption process, go in with those lenses on. I feel like it makes the rest of the adoption process a little bit less bumpy, emotionally at least, for
Yeah,
them.
for sure.
Yep. Elizabeth, your adoption with Grant started out as closed as well, right? So
Correct.
can you tell us a little bit about how yours went from closed to open?
Yeah. So when we first met with Grant's birth mother, we discussed what she wanted, and we actually got the opportunity to do this in person. And we were, of course, at that time hoping for at least some level of openness because we had gotten to know her so well before she gave birth, and before placement. So, when we found out that, or when we heard from her that she preferred only receiving, literally, she only wanted to receive a couple of the picture, like 4 pictures over his first year, and then that was all she wanted. It was heartbreaking for us because she had grown to become one of my greatest friends. And also, just, after placement, just the link that our hearts had together, I couldn't imagine not having a relationship with her. And so it broke my heart, but I continued to, we exchanged, at the time we had exchanged email addresses, and we kept in touch. I would send her just a random email. She would sometimes wait a long time to respond, but then she would respond. And then that quickly grew into her expressing the desire to meet me for breakfast. And so then we turned into having like a quarterly breakfast meeting where her and I would do breakfast together. It's just kind of evolved, and now she has expressed interest in wanting to do visits with him. And so I think that it's just a great picture of the fact that you have to go into adoption with and levels of openness, knowing that it's not one concrete thing. This is not like, if she does, and some people, every adoption is different, obviously, but if she says she wants closed initially, it may always be closed, but it might end up turning into a completely full adoption. Like, now we have each other's numbers and we're planning visits with Grant, and it's just not at all what I thought it would, what it was going to be. I thought what it was going to be, 4.5 years ago.
I love that.
Yeah, for sure. Kind of the same thing with Alame's birth mom and the boy's birth mom. She initially wanted a completely closed adoption, but we already had each other's numbers because we had a 4-month match, and so we were texting back and forth during that period. And once the adoption was done and I had Alame home, we just continued that relationship, and that opened up the door for whenever she needed Josh and I to step in and parent the boys, supposed to be temporarily. We were able to come alongside her and be able to be a person of support during that time as well, which ultimately led to the adoption of Avery and Ayers.
I love that.
Yeah. So Macie, would you agree that this is something, as far as the level of openness, that you have to, as an adoptive family, go into it being willing to be fluid with the level of openness?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it just goes back to understanding that adoption is about so much more than just us as the hopeful adoptive and adoptive parents. This is not just about us getting a child. I hate that term. I just don't know how else to say it.
Right.
But it's really about so much more. This is their child that they're entrusting to you. And so I think that being as open as possible in an ideal situation is just the right thing to do. It just feels icky to me, if it can be done well, to keep the door closed just because. So I think I would always be willing to hold that with open hands for sure.
And Quiverful doesn't even approved families to become active with us that only want a closed adoption now.
Yeah.
So that's one of the ways that we feel like we're moving forward.
I think that's
Well.
awesome. And I also think along those lines too that for one thing that I hear from birth mothers literally almost every day is that the family made promises that they didn't intend on keeping. And so I would say
Yeah.
for hopeful adoptive parents, if you're willing to say like, yes, I'll have an open adoption, sure, I'll have visits, I'll do all this stuff, but once those papers are signed, you are not comfortable with that or you're not willing to do that, don't do that. That is so wrong. It's
Right.
so heartbreaking. And just hearing how upsetting this is for these mothers, like I chose this family because they promised they would still allow me to be a part of the child's life and they wouldn't shut me out, but then they did shut me out. It's just so sad. And so I think that if you don't want an open adoption, that's fine. You're going to have to find the right agency for you, but please just be honest about
Right.
what you're willing to do and what you're not, because this is about so much more than just us.
Right. And
Right.
even when you're looking at situations, whether they're coming from your agency or attorney or whoever you're working with, and they say like the expectant mother desires one visit a year, we should be looking at that as adoptive families as the floor, not the ceiling. Like
Yes.
this should be like the very minimal that we are we are comfortable with. We're comfortable with this plus
Yes.
more if it turns into more over the
So
years.
true. I love that.
So let's talk about naming the baby. This is a question that we actually just got this morning.
Oh.
How did y'all come up with Judah's name?
So, this is actually a pretty awesome story and something that we're currently walking through, even though he's 13 months old. So, when we started the process, we didn't know much and we didn't know what we know now. And I'm so thankful for Grace, and we're all learning, and I'm still learning things every day. But basically, when we first started the process, we knew we were going to adopt a girl. We were not gender specific, but I don't know, I could just see it if it's going to be a girl. And of course I was wrong, but we had this name picked out, this girl name, and at first it was like, "Oh yeah, when we adopt, this is what we're going to name the baby." And we knew we potentially might adopt a boy too, but we didn't really have a name on our radar. And then the more that I learned, the more I was like, what am I doing? This is someone else's child. And so then it became one of those things where, okay, well, if we get chosen by an expectant mom, this can just be something that we decide together. And if she feels really passionately about it, we would just let her choose the name because this is her child. And also, even if we were chosen, we still wouldn't name that child or say, this is our due date or whatever, because it's not our child yet. It's still her child. And so I think there's nothing wrong with having names picked out in the back of your mind and knowing, well, if it's up to us and we get to choose, this is what we would choose. But anyway, so we ended up adopting Judah, who is obviously not a girl, and we were driving to the hospital. And we were like, oh my gosh, we need a name. What are we doing? We don't even have a name. And so we just did a quick Google, biblical boy names, and went through them all. And Judah means praise or thanks to God with lifted hands. And of course, we were like, oh my gosh, this is perfect. And I still love it. And so we chose that, and it was like, okay, we've got this. And then we got there with you, Casey, and met him and everything, and then we saw up on the board in his room that his birth mom had named him Dylan, and it literally makes me want to cry. But at the time, we just did not know what we know now, and we were like, oh, okay, well, I guess we'll just name him Judah because that's what we had chosen. We just did not know any better. And now, after hearing from so many adoptees, especially who have had name changes and whatnot, that they literally feel split between multiple identities and their adoptive parents were trying to erase who they were and start fresh, it rips my heart out. And anyway, for the first couple of months, I honestly didn't give it much thought. But then as our openness grew with Judah's birth parents and I would talk to his birth mom, I noticed that she would never say his name. Like she would just be like, "How's the baby doing? How is he doing?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm sure it's because in her heart he is Dylan." And Greg and I didn't really talk about it much. And then a few months ago, I went to him and I was like, I know this might sound crazy, but I've been praying about it and I really think we should do a legal name change and add the name Dylan back into his name as his middle name. And I don't feel like that was right of us to do, but I think we can make it right now. And he said the Lord was laying the same thing on his heart and he totally agreed. So we are going through the process now of changing his name, and we kind of wanted to do it as his first name, but then we were like, well, he's like established now as Judah, but and it would be confusing for him for his whole life if we made Dylan his legal first name. And then everywhere he went, they were like, Dylan, and he had to correct them. Well, I go by Judah. And of course, we'll let him go by whatever he
Right.
wants. But I ended up reaching out to his birth mom and just wrote her this long text and just said, I'm so sorry. I wish I knew what I know now back then, but we just wanted to do this to honor you. And I'm sure in your heart his name will always be Dylan. And so we want to honor that. I want you to know you can always call him that. And I want him to know that as well. And she appreciated it so much. She said she was bawling and thank you so much. And so anyway, kind of a long story, but yes, I would do things very differently next time for sure.
Right. Well, I think that that's super helpful for all of our listeners out there that are hopeful adoptive families. And I think that the name thing is a difficult thing to navigate, but I think that that's a great example of just loving Judah's birth mom really well. I want to ask a little bit, I want you to tell us just a little bit about AdoptWell and how that even began to be something that you felt like the Lord was calling you to do. And then share a little bit about what it's developed into.
Sure. Yeah. So, we have always been the type of people who were always like pursuing something or doing something outside of our jobs or whatever. We're just like kind of creatives, entrepreneurial minded. And we felt the Lord calling us a couple years ago to close a door on a business that we had had for like 10 years. And it was terrifying, but we knew it was Him. And so we went into a season of a couple years of rest when we were adopting, and basically our son's almost first year of life. And then I could feel the Lord stirring something in me like, I'm about to call you into something new. I'm doing a new thing here. And one night, my husband was in Mexico on a work trip at a 5-star resort, and I couldn't go. And I was home and I was super sick and I couldn't sleep. And the Lord just began downloading this idea in my mind. And so I got out my phone and I was like typing things down like, create an educational community for people who are hoping to adopt, have adopted, and even where people can send their friends and family and say, hey, we're hoping to adopt. Can you follow this page so you can be learning how we can all be the best we can for this child? And so God just began downloading this idea of creating something where people could go to get adoption education specifically from all members of the triad, because 99% of everything adoption out there is from the adoptive parent perspective. And so it was very important to me. Let's look at the big picture here. Let's learn from birth parents. Let's learn from adoptees, because ultimately the adoptee is the one person who did not have a say in any of this. And so we should be listening to them, especially. And so Greg and I are just constantly learning and talking through our own adoption and our hopes for future adoptions and just talking about how to do it well. And one day we were driving in the car and he was like, well, we just need to do this well. And I was like, that's it. Adopt well. We'll call it Adopt Well. And that's really how it came about. So it was kind of a leap of faith. I just kind of made a website like adoptwell.com and made an Instagram and began my own journey of getting educated and becoming a student, and then just kind of sharing the things that I have learned and giving a voice to members of the triad to share. And it's been really amazing. When I first launched it, I was so nervous because you're starting from nothing, as I'm sure you guys know with Quiverful, and it was just me and it was just an idea, and I was kind of like, okay, well, what if I do this and I only get like 100 followers? And then the Lord totally rebuked me and was like, if I only ever give you 100 followers, you need to be faithful to lead the 100 well. But what has been so amazing is it's only been a few months and we already have over 5,000 followers on Instagram, and I've learned so much, and from what I hear, it's been really helpful to a lot of people. So it's been amazing.
We can concur with that.
Yes, it's definitely been helpful for us and all of our adoptive families that we have heard feedback from. So thank you so
Yes.
much just for following in the Lord's lead and in the calling on your life. We are so excited for what's to come with AdoptWell.
So, Macie, real quick before we leave, what's one piece of advice that you would give to any family who is currently considering pursuing adoption?
I would say that the biggest thing would be to just lay down all of your desires. I know it's so hard because, especially with something like adopting, you are longing and yearning for this child and to be a parent, and it's so emotionally charged, but we can't do it well if we're only thinking about ourselves and what we want and what we hope for and how we feel. And so I think it's a constant dying to self of saying, okay, well, this makes me uncomfortable, or I wasn't prepared for this, or whatever the case may be, but saying, nope, this isn't just about me. This is about so much more than me. So I'm going to lay down my own desires. I'm going to lay down my own feelings, and I'm going to do what I feel like is right in this situation. And so really just being willing to let the Lord lead you and do the things that are hard and be willing to put in the work on the front end. I mean, learning is a lifelong process, but putting in the work on the front end to get educated and to be as prepared as you can possibly be, to focus way more on preparing for raising an adoptee and loving birth parents well than you focus on like preparing a nursery and things like that, I would say.
Well, Macie, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. I just want to share with our listeners that if they want to follow along with AdoptWell, they can find you on Instagram at AdoptWell. And you also have a website, correct?
Yes, we do.
Okay, and that website is?
The website is just www.adoptwell.com.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Macie, for all of your time. We have really enjoyed chatting with you.
Yes, thanks for having me, guys.
Have you heard about the Promise Summit? If you are out there and you're listening right now and you are hoping to adopt, or you're an adoptive parent, or you're struggling with infertility, or maybe you feel called to adoption and you just have no clue where to start, then you need to be at the Promise Summit. Casey, tell us a little bit about what the Promise Summit is.
The Promise Summit is a Christian conference for couples considering adoption, in the wait of adoption, and or families who have adopted. This event is packed with powerful speakers, incredible worship, and a panel that represents all members of the adoption triad, and is sure to be a weekend that you will never forget. Our hope is that you leave the Promise Summit forever changed and armed with the promises from God that will encourage you throughout your entire adoption journey.
The Promise Summit will be held May 3rd and 4th in Greenville, South Carolina, and we would love to meet you there. You can find out more information at thepromisesummit.com or on Instagram at thepromisesummit.